here. So, this is Ruxandra and Justin, and we're recording the first episode from the new TRINICY project of apologetics. Justin is a gifted apologist. I'm a geographer. My background is in geoscience, and I enjoy a lot apologetics in the scientific realm, especially related to the Genesis account. Before I would let Justin introduce himself and talk a little bit about his interest in apologetics and his educational background, I would like to say that this series is meant to help encourage and equip students from all levels and all educational backgrounds, and also professionals from the academic realm, to be more confident and assertive in defending their faith in such an intellectually intimidating context. So, Justin, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself very shortly and talk about your interest in apologetics.
Hi, my name is Justin Angelos, and I have been studying apologetics for some time now. I'm currently at Biola University studying. My interest in apologetics started probably about 10 years ago when a conversation I had with an atheist just pretty much shattered my faith because his argument seemed really good. And at the time, I didn't know why. I didn't even know why I believed. I just knew I believed in Christianity. I just didn't actually know why I believed it. And so shortly after that, I had discovered the work of Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ, and that renewed my faith tremendously. It renewed it. And so once I read, actually, no, it was the documentary, The Case for Christ. I started reading other apologetics books and then started to discover that, well, atheism can't possibly be true. There's just no way it's true. And then the more I started to realize that the evidence for Christianity is actually pretty strong, pretty overwhelming, just the more I started to study apologetics, the more my faith grew. Then my faith became built, in my opinion, it became built on something tangible. So that was kind of what led me to really pursue apologetics on an academic level. I met Ravi Zacharias briefly in 2014.
That is incredible.
Yeah, it was it was at one of his lectures. And I took his apologetics courses that he offers online. You can still take them, rzimacademy.org. I think that was my first that was my first actual apologetics classes online. It's like 12 weeks. But I just kept going, and now I'm at Biola University, and my love for apologetics is because I have a passion for reaching people that was like me. I had almost become an atheist because I actually could not defend my faith at all. And so that's kind of the motivation behind my apologetics studies.
Yeah, that's very important because what I wanted to talk about next is why is apologetics important for a Christian? Because as you mentioned, it can get very comfortable for Christians who have a Christian household, they have Christian parents, a Christian upbringing, they attend church, but once they go out into the world, for instance, going to college, leaving your family behind and encountering strong questions, hard questions for the first time, and then you realize that you don't have the answers and your faith might be attacked as well. So apologetics is not only important for you in knowing why you believe and having good, strong foundation for life itself and for the environment you're going to move into, but also for the receptor, for the person who's asking the questions, because as Christians, we have obviously the responsibility to give the right answers.
Well, that's a really good question, and I think a very important one. I want to share a story that I heard Sean McDowell tell. It's a personal story of his. You can find this lecture on YouTube. And I think the title of the lecture is, Can the Bible Be Trusted? I think that's the title of it. He's speaking at a church. But anyways, he says he's standing at an Apple store waiting for the new iPhone to come out. And he says that there was a group of kids um, out sharing the gospel. This is in, the city that he lives in, I'm assuming. And the guy in front of him, they tap him on the shoulder and they said, "Hey, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" And he says he literally turns their back to them. Then they walk up to him, he says, and he goes, "Hey, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" And he said he thought he'd play a little joke and pretend to be an atheist. And he asked them why they believed this to be true. And he says, "Well, if you turn to 2 Timothy, there's a passage there that says that all scripture is God inspired." And then he said, "Well, that's a circular argument." He says, "Do you have anything outside the Bible that says the stories contained within it are true?" And that's where they were stumped. They didn't know. And so the problem is most Christians, and I was guilty of it, so I'm not saying this hypocritically, can't really articulate why it's true. And so what happens is when Christians who are raised Christian, and see, I wasn't raised Christian either, so I kind of have, I think, a unique outlook on this particular topic. But when they leave the comfort of their Christian environment and get into a secular university, they're around twice as many atheists and agnostics. And the sad thing is atheists and agnostics are very passionate about their atheism or agnosticism, and they study and they read and they have arguments. Christians don't. They really don't. I mean, they read their Bible, which is, I think, of utmost importance. But Christians don't take the time to develop their intellectual side. And a lot of them think they don't need the evidence. They don't think they need to, develop their brain on a more philosophical level. So when they get to these universities, that's where, from the polls that I have read, 60% of them walk away and start to embrace atheism and evolution and agnosticism. But going back to when I first discovered the case for Christ, when I read this, I went, okay, this is the evidence that I was looking for. It saved me from becoming an atheist. And so this is why I think every Christian has a responsibility to be able to articulate why it's true. And let me elaborate on that for just a minute. When I say articulate, you have to give more than just a circular answer. You can't, when you're talking to an atheist, you can't cite a Bible passage as evidence because that's an argument from authority. They don't believe in the authority that we're ascribing to. So you have to give a better response to why it's true. And that's where apologetics comes in and gives the why. So I think there's a difference between what you believe and why you believe. Most Christians confuse why you believe it for what you believe. You ask the average Christian, why do you believe this is true? They start to share the gospel with you. And you're like, no, I need to know why this is true. I mean, why should I place my, entire, give my life to this? And so that's where I think apologetics really is needed today more so than it ever has been.
That's true, and I think this is the one of the main goals of the series is to encourage people to read and be intellectually active, and that's why at each in the comment section after each episode we're going to leave a lot of resources for people to read and to document themselves to a deeper level on all the topics that we're going to discuss about. And as you said, it's very important as Christians for us. We know that the Bible is the revealed truth of God. But for somebody to even accept the idea of a revealed truth through a book, you have to present some arguments, external arguments, why that book can be considered as such. So extra biblical sources are equally important for somebody who never had any contact with the Bible in the first place.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, and, I don't think that every Christian needs to be at the level of education that, somebody like Ravi Zacharias has or, William Lane Craig, but they should at least have some basic answers to why they believe it. And that, at least that, and I think for most people, just a basic response is enough. Yeah, I mean, so I mean, and there's a book um, you can get on Amazon. It's called The Layman's Guide to Christian Apologetics by Brian Chilton. And it's a really good book. I think it's about $18. It is a really good book. He's a PhD student at Liberty University. And I think that there's some sources, a lot of sources out there just to help the average Christian at least understand why this is true. So at least that way, when they're talking to somebody, they can at least give an intelligent response.
That is so true. And I remember I talked with you before about doubts, that there's two types of doubts, is rational doubts and emotional doubts. And we should be able to identify the source of the doubt when we're talking to a person or when we're approached by somebody. And I think it's very intimidating for a lot of the students. And I myself had this experience in the classroom that a professor in hydrology, it was a very technical class, but he started talking just completely outside of the context, attacking Christianity, that is just fables and it's nonsense and there's no historicity and no facts behind it. And because he was such a high esteemed persona in the university, people were very afraid to even say something back, even though maybe 80% of us were Christians there and we would have liked to say something. So I think it's very important to reinforce the idea that a lot of people don't necessarily are not necessarily equipped in this area, even though they might seem intellectually so intimidating. So even though you're young, you're 18, you're going to college, you're 19 or 20 years old, and you feel so inferior, you do have the truth that is revealed through the Bible. You have the convictions, but you know there are arguments, and you can answer these arguments with really good reasoning behind it.
See, a lot of professors, when they say stuff like that, they say it out of actual ignorance, because historian, even atheist historians would laugh at that assertion. If you look at prominent atheist historian Gerd Ludemann, who's out of Germany, he says two things about Christianity, and he's a very skeptical historian. He says that the evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion under the hands of Pontius Pilate is so strong, it's an indisputable fact. Right there, he disagreed with that professor. And the other thing he says this, he says, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the original 12 had encounters with Christ 3 days after his death. Even the agnostic historian Bart Ehrman out of Chapel Hill, I think he's in North Carolina, says Jesus existed whether you like it or not. And he tells atheists all the time that it's ridiculous to say that this stuff is a myth or a fable or there's no historicity behind it, because it's simply not true. So when these people say this stuff, they're operating out of ignorance. But again, if the average Christian doesn't know how to respond to that, it's going to rock their faith.
It's also important to identify exactly like the emotional doubt. It's a lot of people, they choose to be atheists or call themselves atheists because they do not want God to exist, because that would imply accountability and responsibility for your own life, which would limit their desires or their practices quite a lot. So it's more like a emotional reaction to it. Yeah, it's a moral issue, exactly.
Yeah, it's not an intellectual one, because was it Frank Turek has a really good response to that. He says he'll ask atheists, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? He says if they answer anything other than yes, he says that tells me that the problem is moral, not intellectual. My one book that I have from Lee Strobel, I'm trying to remember the name of it. But anyways, he talks about this very thing all the time, that my mind is going blank. I can't remember what I was going to say now. But anyways, when you talk to the majority of atheists, after you talk to them long enough, you will see that the problem is a moral issue, not an intellectual issue. And just having, I remember what I was going to say now. it was from Lee Strobel. I heard this from Lee Strobel. He said that I think he's the leading professor of philosophy at New York State University. He says, and I quote, he says, "I'm an atheist." And he says, "What troubles me the most is that some of the most well-educated and well-informed people I know are religious believers." He says, "It's not just that I'm an atheist. It's that I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be that way." So, as Ravi once said, he says it's not a suppression, it's not a lack of evidence, it's a suppression of it. They don't want it to be true.
That is true. And I think there's this myth which influences especially the youth, because teenagers and in your early 20s, you're still forming your personality a lot, you're forming your character. There's this myth that there's an absolute intellectual honesty in the scientific world, especially in the academia, that people, they go for the facts, whereas every branch of science has a philosophical basis. And that's something that I would like to talk about in the next episodes, and we're going to have plenty of occasions to do so. And it's very important to know that there's a lack of intellectual honesty in a lot of the academics, in a lot of the academic branches. It's more of a pursuit of greatness in the name of the individual more than anything else that can obstruct what is factual and what is not. And everything starts with a hypothesis, with a worldview. And that's why it's so important to understand what role Christianity plays in science, how important it was in the history of science, and what it means that Christianity is completely eradicated in most academic environments right now. What does that do to pure reason, so to say, in Immanuel Kant's words?
Well, I look at it like this. If God didn't exist, there would be no use of logic and reason and rationale. One of my favorite Christian apologists, John Lennox, a lot of people know who he is. He's a triple doctorate holder in mathematics, teaches out of Oxford. He says that it's because of science that he believes that there's a creator. But yet atheists will still attack him and say he's deluded. But you can't take away that he is highly educated. He's a scientist. I remember speaking with an atheist, I think it was last year, and he says, well, there's no external evidence for the New Testament in the first century. I said, oh, yes, there is. And so I quoted a pagan historian by the name of Phlegon. He confirms that Jesus was called Wise King, that his followers worshipped him, that he was crucified under the hands of Pontius Pilate, that he performed miracles, and that he rose on the third day. He says, well, when was this written? I said, it was written, I said, historians date that letter somewhere between the 50s and the 70s, no later than the 120s AD. Oh, well, that's just too far after. I said, yeah, but you said there was nothing in the first century. I just gave you something from the first century. And so what they do is they try to rationalize it away. They won't accept it. They'll just try to discredit it instead of accept it and say, oh, okay, well, I didn't realize there was something in the first century. Okay, so I'll give you that. Instead of doing that, he started to try to just rationalize it away that it wasn't credible. And then I said to him, I says, well, you know, the first manuscripts we have for Alexander the Great were 450 years later. And again, he started to try to rationalize why that was okay. So, as you were saying earlier, it's the longer you talk to atheists, most of them, it's a moral issue. They just don't want it to be true. But there are those atheists out there and those agnostics that's not the case, that they want to believe, but they just haven't seen enough evidence. And so for me, that is also, I think, a good reason to study apologetics. And again, I can't remember what apologist said this, but find an area that you're really passionate about. You don't have to study everything. I mean, I think it'd take a lifetime, but you know, for me, one of my favorite areas of apologetics is the New Testament manuscripts and the resurrection. I think that's probably one of my most favorite areas of apologetics to study, because I think the New Testament is attacked
Yeah.
almost as much as the Old Testament is.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote by a Romanian philosopher who said that truth cannot be known by mere human endeavor, but can only be revealed. And we have to accept that we are so limited, we're so confined to our own bodies, our own minds. We do not see the entire universe from an external position, so we could analyze everything and know everything about it, so we can know the cause of the universe. So there has to be a truth that was revealed, and that is the
Mm-hmm.
Bible. And probably we
Mm-hmm.
can expand a lot more why the Bible is the most coherent, offers, as Ravi Zachariah said, the most coherent set of answers to the question of origin, morality, meaning, and salvation. I
Destiny.
think that's the quote. So
Yeah, he's
yeah,
no, sorry. Yeah, he's absolutely right. I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah, he's absolutely right. And when you look at just the biblical worldview as a whole, it doesn't contradict its own philosophy. It's logically consistent. Um, the personal relevance side of it is amazing. The transformation it does to the individual, and there is, in my opinion, a tremendous amount of empirical evidence for it as a whole, textually, archaeologically, historically. So yeah, I would agree 100% with Robbie on that. Um, when you place that to like other worldviews, they don't have that same. They don't have that. You take worldviews like Buddhism contradicts its own philosophy, and a lot of the other different worldviews. Relativism is a completely contradictory worldview. It's unlivable. It's like if everybody was to embrace moral relativism, there'd be total anarchy in the streets, I believe.
exactly. And there's
So yeah,
another thing that we hear so much today: speak up your truth, as if truth is so relative to the individual. There's no absolutes, and just the denial of the absolutes is a logical nonsense. As if there is something that is truthful, it is singular, it cannot be plural. Not you cannot have such a thing as several truths that are contradictory and exist at the same time.
no,
So
I
mhm.
no. Go ahead. I'm
Please
sorry.
go on. I just wanted to go on emphasizing how important it is to have a basic understanding of logic and argumentation, because you can deconstruct so many arguments that feel so threatening to our faith by just mere logic. Um,
No, I really I hate to say this, but I get really annoyed with that phrase. My truth. Share your truth. Um, I can't remember who it was. I was reading this in a textbook in one of my philosophy classes. And I don't remember if it was Dr. Horner or if it was Timothy Keller, Pastor Timothy Keller. I don't remember who it was, but the story is a wonderful story. It had to be Dr. Horner. He was teaching at a secular university at one time, and the class was on, I think, ethics or morality or something. And the majority of the class were moral relativists. And so when they wrote their final paper, which determined their final grade, he hands it back to everybody in class, and there's a big red F on the front of the paper. And everybody was just upset. And the professor goes, guys, I've been thinking about what you've been saying about moral relativism and how truth is relative. And he says, I decided to embrace that. It sounded like a good idea. I decided I didn't like the font that you guys used. So I marked your grades down because you used the wrong font that I didn't like at the last minute. And then the one student goes, but wait a minute, that's not in the syllabus. I decided the syllabus wasn't important anymore. And, he kind of kept going on like this and kept going on like this. And everyone was just getting upset. And he says, why are you upset? You said all truth is relative. So to me, this is a good thing. I failed all of you, and it's a good thing. You didn't do what I wanted on the paper, even though I changed my mind at the last minute on how I wanted this to be done. And they said, and then one student said, well, how are we supposed to know what you wanted at the last minute? We can't read your mind. And he says, why are you guys upset? This is my truth. And he says, can you guys do me a favor? And he's like, yes. They said, yes. Turn your paper over and look at your real grade. He said, class, welcome to the world of relativism. And I really, kind of pushed the limit on that one. But he says, I took it to that extreme measure to really drive this point home to them that relativism is an unlivable worldview. But he said, you should have seen the look of relief in their face because not one person failed. And so I'm trying to remember what book I read that out of. It was either The Universe Next Door or Mind Your Faith. It was one of those two books I believe I read that out of. But it was a really good story, and I was laughing, pretty good at that story.
Yeah, but that is a great illustration of moral relativism. It sounds good for me, but not anymore when you apply it or somebody else applies it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you take the average moral relativist. Nobody lives that way. Timothy Keller did say this. He says, how did he say it? He said, nobody lives that way. And he says, I can prove it. He says, go steal their wallet and watch how they react. It was something to that effect. The second you do something to them, all of a sudden they want to hold to an objective moral law.
Yeah, that is true. We have 5 more minutes left. And I would just ask you to maybe if you have any conclusive ideas that you want to talk. And also, I think it would be interesting if we post this on YouTube to ask whoever's watching, maybe they will post personal experiences or questions they encountered wherever they are in college or high school that they didn't know how to tackle well. And we might answer them in the next episodes. I think that would be very interesting to introduce those things in the next themes that we already planned.
I think so too. That'd be a good idea. I think a couple things I'd like to just end on is this. I am in an environment where I would say that I'm probably the minority in what I believe. But I like that, and I'm going to tell you why. It's a chance to really, I think one of the biggest mistakes that some people can make is not taking a genuine interest in what other people believe and not taking the time to really listen. Because the more you listen, because I use apologetics in my daily life, because I always look for an opportunity to share the gospel. But I don't do it right away. I take time to build friendships, and I take the time to build, work relationships. And when you spend enough time listening, I believe it makes you a more effective apologist, in my opinion. So you're not looking, when you're talking to somebody, you're not just looking to hurry and respond to something. You're taking the time to get to know their hurts and why they've abandoned religious faith and all this other stuff. And then you can give a more genuine, heartfelt response. And so that's one of the reasons why I like working around people that disagree with me, or being around people that disagree with me more than people that agree with me. But the other thing I wanted to say is the more, William Lane Craig even said this, the more you know why this is true, the more confidence you get and the less heated you will get in a conversation, because you're confident. And I believe that to be 100% true. In other areas of my life where I have been incredibly confident, I've been able to maintain a cool, calm composure in other areas of my life that I'm really confident in. So I would just say the more you know why Christianity is true, the more confidence you're going to have in an atheist environment or a secular environment. Because it just builds that confidence. It just gives you that. I love talking to atheists. I do. I love talking to them. Not because I agree with them or I want to make them feel good about what they believe. I like talking to them because I love sharing the gospel with them, and I love conversing with them on topics of theology and faith and the existence of God. But you know, I think that is probably um, been the most helpful or useful thing for me. Is the more I know why it's true, the more confidence I gain in sharing it with total strangers.
That's a very great point and something that we should all keep in mind. Because one risk of apologetics is to get lost in the intellectual rush in the moment and think about the arguments and not think about the reason why we're doing this. It's for the love of our neighbor, to share the gospel. It's for Christ. And in the end, it's not us who converts people, it's Christ who does that, and through the Holy Spirit. So we should always keep that
I
in
agree
mind.
with you.
And yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's a meme that you'll see on social media that it's a picture of Christ pulling somebody away, and the caption reads, "I called you to win souls, not arguments." And I think that is a really short-sighted meme, and I don't think there's any biblical foundation to that at all. An argument, at least in the context that I'm referring to, isn't a fight. Even Paul talks about how we need to tear down arguments and stuff like that. If you can't give a well-reasoned argument and win, and overcome objections, I don't know. I just think that the church today needs to really start to step it up, and you know really, I think apologetics, like I said, is more needed today than ever.
Yeah. I think we can conclude by saying that apologetics is more than just answering a question, it's answering the person and understanding where that person
Yes.
is coming from. And that's something Ravi Zacharias has emphasized many, many times. And
Mm-hmm.
I really, it really stuck to my memory. So we're coming to an end. Thank you for today and see you in the next episode.